All right, good evening, everybody. How we doing? All right, cool, good. I'm glad somebody's doing well. That's good. All right. So I think I'm doing my job. I'm successfully dwindling down the crowds on these evenings. So I don't know if it's just getting less interesting, the subjects, or is it me? I don't know, but we'll figure that out. So, but anyway, I love talking about these things. I love learning more about some of the stuff we've been talking about, learning about the church, history of the church, and tonight we're specifically going to talk about the church in America. And we'll talk a little bit about why I think that's important, maybe why you think it's important, because I think it really is, in the moment that we live in, I think it's really, really important to know your history, to know how we got to where we are, that we didn't arrive here in a vacuum, that things influenced along the way, and also to know that things haven't always been the way that they are. One of the things I think that we can do very easily is we can lock into methodologies and think that this has been the way this has always been. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. For instance, the methodology of the church, the way of the church, the way that we know it, how long has that even existed? It's really, really recent. And so what does that mean in terms of the methodology and how important that is and all those kind of things? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But we'll start much earlier, all right? We'll start in about 1600 or so, and we'll move from there. So anyway, since Dwayne's here, Dwayne, will you pray for us as we open?
Lord, thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. We ask that you would take away our distractions and bring us closer to a better knowledge of you and how that can affect the way we interact with each other. Thank you for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So I've got a lot of papers up here. I'm going to try to navigate them cleanly as much as I can, going back and forth a little bit. But if it takes me a minute and I get caught in between, just give me some grace on that, I guess. So we are going to start. I said around 1600. It's actually a few years after that we're going to start today. And we're going to kind of go century by century. So the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, the 2000s. Which are the ones that we find ourselves in right now, right? And we'll talk a little bit about some key figures in each one. We'll talk about church movements, cultural movements in those just a little bit. And hopefully along the way, we'll see kind of a pattern of how we got to where we are. And maybe give us a sense of how we navigate not only where we are, but how we move forward as well. And so the first kind of thing we're going to talk about is the establishment of the first colony in the States, in what we now know as the United States. Anybody know what year that was? A little bit earlier. Anybody know which colony it was? Nope. Where's Jamestown at? It's still in Virginia. So that's actually where it started. In 1607, first colony was established, and it was the Virginia colony, all right? And so the reason we're going to talk, I'm going to go through all of these 13 colonies. The reason I'm going to do it is because you may or may not know this, but in their initial charters and government contracts or government documents, most of them had a specific religious affiliation. So they had a declared church, right? 8 of the 13, I think is what it was, right? So 8 of the 13 colonies, original colonies, had a church that at some level you were expected, if not required, to belong to, right? Why does that matter for us to know? Why does it matter for us to talk about that? Because if you pay attention right now, you have a lot of rhetoric in our culture about going back to kind of the founding principles, and it's important that we understand the founding principles. Where were these people coming from? What were their trains of thought? How did they view religion, not only in their own individual life, but in the life of kind of the community, and beyond that, the colony, the state, the nation, all of those kind of things. And so we're going to kind of walk through these just a little bit. And I say things like that, maybe you have heard this, or maybe you've said this before, right? This was founded as a Christian country. How many of you have ever heard that? How many of you have ever said that? You don't have to raise your hand, it's okay. I probably have at some point in my life. Well, this was founded as a Christian country. At some level, that's true. The question then becomes, what kind of Christian country? Because I don't know if you know this, but we don't all agree on everything. Was it a Catholic Christian country? Was it Protestant? If it was Protestant, what kind of Protestant was it? What was their view of the role of government? All of these things were conflicting from the beginning in many ways. And so it's what I want to walk through as we look at the establishment of the colonies. So the first one is Virginia. Anybody have any ideas what their declared religious allegiance was to? What church? Anglicans. So the Church of England. And where did the Church of England come from? The Catholic Church. Why did they split? Somebody needed a divorce, primarily the King of England. And the Pope said no, and he said, well, that's fine. I'll just form my own church then. And he did, right? Largely with many of the liturgies and the kind of trappings and the system of the Catholic Church, he just ordained his own priesthood, right? And he kind of told them what he wanted them to do and that kind of thing. So it's interesting. Virginia is founded in 1607. They form as an Anglican colony, which is the church that we always hear that Americans were, or that colonists were trying to get away from. They were fleeing this. And yet, the first established church in the United States is exactly the church that they were allegedly fleeing. Does that make sense? So maybe just the narrative is not exactly what we've always been told. That's what I want us to kind of think about just a little bit. All right, second one, any idea? So 1607, Virginia. The next one is in 1620. Somebody guessed 1620 for the first one, but it was actually the second one. Any idea? A little bit further north? Massachusetts. So Boston. And it was actually originally called the Plymouth Colony until 1630 when it was renamed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that was largely because the companies that sponsored the colony changed names and hands, right? So Virginia was Anglican. What about Massachusetts? Any guesses? Puritan. More Puritan. What we would call, I guess at some level, Congregationalist at the time, but not all Congregationalists were Puritan. So, kind of what you need to know about Massachusetts, it plays a big role in kind of religious liberty and religious kind of exclusivism in the early colonies. So it's established as a Puritan colony. Kind of the major figure of that is a guy named John Winthrop, who was the first governor of that colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he's the guy who famously articulated a phrase that you may have heard, a city upon a hill. That we want to establish a city upon a hill. We want to establish this ideal place that anyone of faith can come and live as long as you're Puritan. And out of that, they developed some really significant religious laws, blasphemy laws, church attendance laws. Didn't take very long that they were banishing people from the colony. There's a lady named Anne Hutchinson who famously, there was something called the Antinomian Controversy in the 1630s, and they banished these people and said, you can never come back here, because they questioned the Puritan clerics, they questioned the system of government that they were developing. That from the beginning, Massachusetts was designed as a theocracy at some level. That it was meant to be led by the church, right? Again, the problem is that church had very little grace and mercy for anybody who was not part of that church, right? So again, when we talk about this idea of being a Christian nation, we also have to talk about what kind of Christians are we talking about. Does that make sense? That because throughout history, anytime there's been a Christian nation, they've ended up banishing and eventually killing other Christians. That's a repeated pattern of history that is consistent, right? And we see it happening very, very early, even in the colonies before the establishment of the United States. All right? So, city upon a hill. Anybody know which later candidate used that a lot? That was a big Reagan line. Reagan talked a lot about the city upon a hill, right? So where did they originally take that from? Anybody know? It actually comes from Matthew. It's a language that we see biblically reflected. that it will be a city upon a hill, that we're to be a city upon a hill, something that shines for everybody to see, right? But I think if you go back and actually read the words of Jesus, he's not talking about a nation state there. He's talking about the people of God are to be this thing, right? And so, from a very early stage in our country's history, people have used the Bible to try to move forward their own preferences, their own kind of things. So I just want you to know that that's not a new thing. It's been happening for a long time and not just in our country, right? So Massachusetts, number 2. Number 3 is New Hampshire, which was also settled. It was settled in 1623, or that's when it was actually declared a colony or legalized as a colony. Initially settled by Puritans as well, but much more religiously diverse over time. So they were not quite as dogmatic as the folks over in Massachusetts. Number 4 in 1634 was Maryland. And Maryland was formed why? Anybody know? Because Catholics were being persecuted in the other colonies. And so Maryland was started as a Catholic refuge to protect them from all the other Christians. And they're named after Queen Mary, right? So, and if you know anything about what was happening in England about that same time, there's something called the gunpowder revolt, where basically they tried to blow up Parliament, and that was between Protestants and Catholics. Right? They came really close to blowing up Parliament with loads of gunpowder, and this was not too long before this. So, all of that animosity that existed in Europe for a long time also made its way over with all these people who were coming, right? So you have Maryland in 1634, which is Catholic officially. You have Connecticut in 1636, which is also Puritan, with a strong congregational bent, which meant like no over-learning authorities. Every congregation was kind of their own, right? Which is a little bit different than what we saw happen in Massachusetts. Next is Rhode Island, which was founded by a guy named, anybody know? Roger Williams. And was originally home to Quakers, but also some Baptists, and it was known for welcoming pretty much anybody, right? Because the Quakers, everywhere they had ever been, had been oppressed by everybody else, and so they kind of said, hey, listen, we don't want to do that. So if you'll just kind of be at peace, you can come live here, right? So Rhode Island, 1636, mainly Quaker, or Brethren, some sense in there, but also some Baptist, mostly Anabaptist there. The next was Delaware in 1638, which was primarily settled by people from Sweden. So their predominant religion in Delaware, because they were Swedish, would have been Lutheran. They were primarily Lutherans. So we've only talked about, about 7 state colonies now? How many different versions of Christianity have we talked about? And they don't always get along. Like, they think that their colony is the right one, right? We've got this right, except for a few. Then they moved south just a little bit in 1653, North Carolina. North Carolina did not have a particular religious affiliation. It was made up mostly of Anglican and dissenting Protestant groups, including Baptist and Quakers, right? So North Carolina, again, was kind of like, hey, listen, just don't make trouble for everybody, right? And we'll go along with that. Followed by South Carolina in 1663. South Carolina did have a religious affiliation, which was Anglican, but they also had a pretty diverse population of French Huguenots. So they had French Catholics, right, or French Protestants, and Baptists and others as well. So even though they had an established kind of connection with the Anglican Church, they really didn't exclude others from that necessarily, as long as they kind of didn't make issues for other people. All right. 1664, New York. Most of the early settlers of New York were Dutch Reformed. So predominantly from the beginning, they were Reformed in the Dutch school, kind of. But as we know about New York, it quickly became kind of a melting pot of various religions, right? A lot of Anglicans, a lot of Quakers, a lot of Catholics eventually. That happened more in the 1800s with the immigration from Ireland and from other parts of Catholic Europe, but also a large Jewish population from the beginning in New York, right? So a pretty diverse place, even though it started largely as Dutch Reformed. Then you have New Jersey, 1664 as well, which did not have an affiliation, an established affiliation. And again, it was pretty diverse. You had Quakers, Anglicans, Dutch Reformed as well. Number 12, Pennsylvania in 1681. So you have 17 years between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, right, which is a pretty good span of time in here, where there are no colonies that actually come in or establish there. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, yep, as a refuge for Quakers. So like Maryland was for Catholics, Pennsylvania became that largely for Quakers, or for people from the German Brethren kind of movements, right? Quakers and others in those movements. And it was known for promoting religious tolerance, and because of that, it attracted a pretty diverse group of people, right? So it was founded largely on religious tolerance, and was kind of a leading model of that later on as they were established in the U.S. And then the last of what we would consider the 13 original colonies would be, anybody know? It's the penal colony, literally. Georgia. Some would say it's still that, including me. Chuck Fitz might not like that, but that's all right. So 1733, it was initially founded as a debtors' colony. So that's where they sent the debtors, people who were in debt. It was kind of a debt prison. It had a mix of Anglican and other Protestant settlers, but it was also known for a pretty good degree of religious tolerance, right? That at that point, their uniting factor was not religion, it was the fact that they were all starving, and they had to help each other out a little bit. So as we kind of go through that and this idea of the founding, the colonies, and kind of their connection with religion, why does that matter to us? Why is that important to know? Does it change anything for you knowing that?
Isn't it the evolution, or the beginning of the evolution of where we are today?
Yeah. I think we still feel we're downstream of that, right? So some of that stuff has flowed to us from all of those places, right? But for me, what it does is it really expands the narrative that we generally hear. Because we generally hear that they were fleeing the Anglican Church and the oppression of the king, and they came and they were all just trying to form this new Christian country, and that's true for a large part of these immigrants. But the type of Christian country they were thinking of was a very different one. The Catholics weren't thinking of the same one necessarily that the Anglicans were, right? That there was a lot of interest in this idea of a place where they could practice their religion freely. But Massachusetts approached that very different from Rhode Island. Massachusetts said, hey, listen, you're free to practice your religion as long as it's Puritan. Rhode Island said, hey, listen, as long as you don't make trouble with everybody else, let everybody do their thing, we're probably okay. And so those are two very different visions of what it means to be a Christian state, a Christian colony, a Christian nation. And so part of why this matters is we find ourselves back in a time where you've got people wrestling both sides again, I think. There are people who literally want to strip away amendments right now to bring back Christian monarchs and all of these kind of things in our culture. And if we're not careful, and if we don't really understand where this came from and kind of how all this is developed, I feel like we can be very susceptible to some of these voices, if that makes sense. because they tell a very appealing narrative. The only problem is it's incomplete at best and it's disingenuous at worst, right? And so it's so important that we understand where this stuff comes from, how it's developed, the good, the bad, the ugly, all that stuff, right? And so from the beginning, we see a complexity to this, man. Like people that agreed on some things, but they also disagreed on some stuff, right? And so to pretend that when we say the word Christian, that includes everybody in the same way, it's just not quite true, right? We all have different visions of what this may look like, especially when it comes to how Christianity should influence the government, how it should impact culture, all those kind of things, all right? So all of that happened basically during the 1600s, except for Georgia, which came just a little bit later. So let me give you a couple things to think about during the 1600s that were really important that happened here, other than what we just talked about. So it was kind of the foundation of us as a system of colonies, leading up eventually to a nation. So we talked about this. The 1600s kind of marked this establishment of European colonies in North America, each of them bringing very distinct Christian traditions. So if you're coming from Bavaria, or you're coming from Sweden, or you're coming from France where the Huguenots were persecuted, you have a very different sense than if you're coming from northern England or central England, right? That those are not the same things. They don't have the same theologies. They don't have the same beliefs about the world and the nature of it. And so trying to mix all of that together is never going to be like a neat, cohesive thing necessarily, right? And it's important for us to kind of understand that. You have the Puritans who kind of settled primarily in New England. Their goal was to create a pure Christian society. We want a city on a hill, a pure Christian society. While others, like the Anglicans and the Quakers, they settled all across in these various regions, and they all kind of had their own regional, town-wise, all these kind of different emphases and community practices. And so for them, what united them was not something that they tried to force on everybody else. It was something that allowed them to actually coexist, right? They weren't trying to impose it on everybody. They were trying to live in harmony with one another, recognizing that people were different and had different expectations of all of those things, right? So within this, you see really the beginning of what we would call religious pluralism that we experience very differently than most countries, right? That most countries don't deal with this in the same way. But because we're a nation of immigrants from all over the world, that pluralism is a reality for us. We may not like it. We may think there are things that are harmful or challenging about it, and that is true. But it is a reality of where we are and where our country has kind of always been. And so how do we navigate that in a way that we love each other well and that we give God glory in a way that people see his goodness, right? So as different denominations began to coexist in this period, there was a lot of tension that arose over the concept of religious freedom. What did religious freedom mean? So there was an act that was passed in 1649 in Maryland. Why was it passed in Maryland? Because they had largely been thrown out of everywhere else. So in 1649, something's passed called the Maryland Toleration Act, right? Which exemplified early efforts to ensure freedom of worship, particularly for Catholics, amidst a largely Protestant landscape. So because they had been pushed out of other colonies largely, said you're not wanted, they formed this colony largely built around Catholicism. And one of the recognitions they have is we don't necessarily want to be treated the way that they treated us. We're going to give people some breadth and some width that if they want to practice their faith differently, okay. That is not a recent development in our country. It was 1649. So the first colony, 1607, this act is passed in 1649. That's only 42 years. It only took 42 years from the time the first colony was established till the time another colony had to be established because they kicked people out because they weren't practicing the right religion. 42 years. So when we talk about this idea of coming together and forming this nation bent around Christian liberties, it wasn't from the beginning that everybody wanted Christian liberty. From the beginning, most of it was we want our version of Christianity. And if you don't like it, you can walk over there and start your own place. This is our place. That from the beginning, that has been a challenge, right? And so how do we see that? How do we recognize that as part of our formation in history? And how do we not fall into that same place? How do we not become those telling others how to live, right? It's one thing to invite people towards a better way. It's another thing to insist that they live in the way that you proclaim, right? And so from the beginning, we've seen that. And so you had key figures like Winthrop, who we talked about in Massachusetts, articulating a vision for the colony as a city upon a hill, emphasizing moral and spiritual responsibilities of settlers to create a model Christian society. What would a model Christian society look like? Any ideas? What would that look like? Which Jesus? I guess it would be the kingdom. But here's the thing. None of us are going to bring the kingdom in. Not fully. We're meant to bring it in through our lives, influencing the lives of other people, that the kingdom will never be brought in through governmental systems. It'll be brought in through the people who follow Jesus, who live that out every day. And that may influence governmental systems. Don't get me wrong. Nothing wrong with we should be good citizens. I believe that. Active citizens in the place that we are. But at the same time, that's not our ultimate hope, right? That there are always going to be challenges in nations and states and cities because we don't all agree on everything. Not just between believer and unbeliever, but between believer and believer, right? And it's also a reminder that Jesus matters more than our own preferences about how we do this thing, right? That the methodology is not nearly as important as the message. And the message has always been Jesus, right? And when we forget that, it creates challenges. So even from the beginning in the 1600s, we have these challenges, and we see that develop into these separate colonies that are kind of trying to pursue this their own way, which kind of leads us into the 1700s, right? So we're still 75 years at the beginning of that century, 75, 76 years from the foundation of the country. So you think about that. All of this happened for about 150, 170 years before it was even a country, before we even obtained freedom at that level in terms of revolution, right? So a couple of things to keep in mind about the 18th century, marked by a couple of things. First of all, the First Great Awakening. So the time frame for that, for the First Great Awakening, was 1730s, 1740s, right? And that's really the first spiritual kind of renewal that we see historically in the U.S., right? And there were some key figures in that. One of them, Jonathan Edwards. You guys might have heard of Edwards, right? He's famous for a particular sermon that he did, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he said things like, we're like spiders dangling over the fire, right? And he was notoriously monotoned and a bad speaker. But he did really well at making people afraid, right? Like, so he was really known for making people afraid of hell, right? That was kind of his driving point. But he was very influential in New England especially. Very influential leading up to the Revolution, these ideas of what it meant to have kind of a personal faith. So you get people like Jonathan Edwards. You get somebody like George Whitefield, who was really kind of known as the kind of America's first preacher, really. He did these open air meetings, right? So outside churches, out in kind of these common areas, and he was known to be very eloquent, very kind of moving for people in a way that Edwards was not necessarily known for, right? But Edwards came from what tradition? Anybody know? He was Puritan. He came from a Puritan kind of background. So he was very like, either do it this way or like burn, right? Like this is the way, right? So he was a little bit more of that. Whitefield came from a little bit more of a congregational standpoint, so a little bit more influenced by probably some of the German Brethren stuff originally. And And kind of his emphasis was more on emotional experience, personal salvation over traditional rituals. So if you think about that, it was really the first time where they had revival meetings in the U.S., right? So you would have seen some tent meetings a little bit there, or they call them brush arbor meetings, because they met out in kind of these like open spaces and people would sit on like little planks and stuff, right? But really, Whitefield was one of the developers of that in the 1730s and 1740s. So what we call the First Great Awakening, that church attendance prior to that, in the time of the colonies, was in the 30% range. And it rose to 70 to 80% in those two decades. Right? So you had a tremendous move in terms of people coming to faith, or at least coming back to church, right? And part of that was they were actually building churches, so people had places to go to and those kind of things. So the first two, that First Great Awakening in the 1730s, 1740s, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, there are others in that period, but those are two that are really, really well known. Yes, sir.
So when they formed these original colonies,
Mm-hmm.
and they were associated with particular denominations, I'm assuming that church attendance was probably pretty high initially.
Like I said, in Massachusetts, for instance, you actually had laws on the books that required attendance.
So what was going on that caused them to drift from high attendance down to the 30s?
I think it was later in the 1600s, early 1700s. So you had 50 or 60 years of like mandated. Some of those laws kind of relaxed over time. They just didn't really enforce them as much. And I think a lot of it was people kind of, the really like stringent colonies like Massachusetts actually saw a lot of movement out to other places. Right? People left Massachusetts and went to Pennsylvania. They went to all these other places where there was more religious liberty. And in those states, you didn't have, attendance laws. You didn't have moral laws in the same way. You didn't have blasphemy laws, right? So when I say blasphemy laws, everybody have a picture of that? So think in modern day Islamic countries. If you insult the prophet, right? You draw a picture of Muhammad, like you're in Yemen, you're going to have problems. The police are going to come pick you up, right? Or you're going to have to pay a fine or blah, blah, blah. So some of these early colonies literally had those kind of things on the books, right? If you insult the church, right? If you insult clergy. It's one of the reasons I talked about Anne Hutchinson, who was run out of Massachusetts in the 1630s. Her big offense was that she was telling people to question the Puritan clergy, that they didn't have to go to those churches. And so what did they do? They arrested her. And then they threw her out of the colony, banished her for life, and everybody who followed her. So it doesn't take a whole lot of years of that for people to go, yeah, this is not for me. This is not for me. And you saw a lot of corruption within government and church that were closely affiliated in some of those colonies, right? Which also carried over from Europe. And so I think what you had for a long time, Steve, maybe that first 50 years, is you had people who were idealistic, who thought we've left Europe, we've left all that stuff behind, this is a new thing. And then they realized it wasn't new. It was just different crooks. A lot of them. Right? Not a whole lot changed. You still had like collusion and corruption, and you still had people saying it's my way or the highway, right? What's the difference between a king telling you what church you have to go to and a governor? There's no difference, right? At least the king believes he was sent by God. The governor doesn't even believe that. He just wants to tell you what to do. You know what I mean? And so I think in the 1670s, 1680s, you saw a pretty gradual decline, right? And then here comes Edwards, here comes Whitefield, kind of this grand movement, right? That was not just within a colony, but it moved largely throughout the whole of them. And you really had this genuine, what I would say is a genuine move of God. That God is saying, hey, we need to, listen, I'm going to move and do things in a way that these men did not. And it's going to be a genuine thing. Now, the interesting thing is that about every 100 years in America, you have one of these. So it's like for 10 or 15 years, God's like, all right, let's get this thing moving again. And then for 85 years, humans kind of gradually mess it up. And then God does it again because he's gracious, I think. He's gracious. And so I think we are a people that constantly have to be awakened. Because all of these movements start, the consistency, if you study the first awakening, the second awakening, even other movements in Scandinavia before that in places, the movements always start with one or two people who kind of have this like, these experiences. Not through other people, but almost like directly with God, and they feel like called to this thing, and they give their lives to it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And then eventually, other people step in and they're like, well, here's how we manage this. And gradually then, the methodology becomes more important than what started it. How we manage this becomes more important than how it started. And so then that's the decline, right? And so it's kind of like this, it's almost like a roller coaster cycle. It goes up really fast, and then it kind of gradually goes down until the next hill. And so the question, if that's the pattern, and it seems to be in American history, not just American, but beyond that, but especially in American history, about every 100 years you have this awakening. Where are we? Where are we? So that's part of my question. Is part of the reason it's important to look at these things, I think, is we see pattern. We see consistent patterns of the way that people have done things. And we're not different than those people generally. So what can we learn from this? Right? And we'll get into modern church. I don't want to jump the gun here. I have my own opinions about that, and we'll get into it, kind of the modern movements a little bit. But anyway, so that's the colonial period. Any questions about colonial period? That's a great question, by the way, Steve. I wish I had a better answer. All right. So we'll move kind of into the 1800s just a little bit, the early 1800s, which is where we see the Second Great Awakening. So it's post-revolution, kind of post-War of 1812, really starts in the early 1820s. So you have a lot of conflict early in the U.S., right? Finish the revolution, takes a while to get the Constitution done because, again, all these colonies are arguing with each other about who's going to be most important, right? Who has the most representatives, all that stuff, right? Then you have the War of 1812. The British are like, hey, here's a chance. Let's go burn Washington and all that. And so out of that, one of the other patterns you see is anytime there's great calamity, especially in terms of military calamity, after it, you see a huge rise in church attendance. The great calamities in the U.S. have always led to people coming back to churches. We see that post-World War I at some level. We see it hugely post-World War II with the boomers, right? And the greatest generation. I don't use that term derisively. I'm trying to use it accurately. Think about 9/11. Attack on New York City. What happened to churches in the year or two after that? Everybody comes back, or a lot of people come back, right? The problem with that is we don't see it sustained very long, for the most part, right? It goes pretty quickly, right? So it seems like a lot of emotional driven type of movement at times, right? And so, the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, which is the 1820s, 1830s. This was kind of marked by camp meetings. Anybody ever been to a camp meeting? You're obviously not from the South. My wife has been to a camp meeting. Your grandfather probably led camp meetings. I've been to camp meetings, which in the South is awful because they do them in summer, and they're outside, and then there's bugs everywhere, and they last for like 4 hours. They sing for like 3 hours. And then a guy preaches for another 2. right? So I know that's 5, not 4. I got it. But you always think it's going to be 4, but it ends up being like 5, right? Um, and so if you grow up in that, especially if you grow up in Pentecostal or Charismatic or Southern Baptist circles, man, you have been to a camp meeting if you live in the South. So that all kind of flows from that Second Great Awakening. That's where they kind of started, was they were drawing crowds that were much larger than any church buildings they had. You didn't have big church buildings that would hold these amounts of people, right? Big churches, you really did not see anything that would hold 1,000 people plus until late 1800s, early 1900s. So the crowds that were coming to hear these men speak, right? Charles Finney, Billy Sunday, later on, all of these like renowned kind of traveling preachers, right? The crowds were so large, the only place they could do it was outside, right? So that's kind of where the camp meeting idea started. Those camp meetings were really marked not only by being outside, but you kind of had these communal movements where whole communities would come to Jesus, right? They would baptize hundreds of them in a night, right? And so it wasn't just 1 or 2 people in a town coming back to Jesus. It was everybody's coming back to Jesus now, right? And so you had these huge movements that were driven by community-specific kind of movements within that. A lot of them were very emotional, right? So this is kind of the early days of the Methodist Church, right? And I don't know if you guys know this. Do you know where the Charismatic Church and where Pentecostal churches come from? Methodism. So their theology is Methodist, right? If you go to your average UMC church and you look at their theological statements, they're going to be pretty similar to what you would see in terms of soteriology, basic theology, as you would in holiness churches, in Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches. Most of them flow from Methodism, right? So John Wesley, Charles Wesley, that early movement, right? You see a large influx of that. And that was largely grown in the 1800s by, you guys have heard the term circuit riders? So that was largely Methodist preachers who would ride from city to city or village to village or town to town, and they had anywhere between 4 and 8 that they were responsible for. And so you had church once a month. Once every 6 weeks, a preacher would come in. You would probably meet every week, but you only had an official preacher about every 6 or 7 weeks, right? And so that's really how Methodism grew, especially in the West, the Midwest and the West, was through those circuit riders. They were willing to do things that the more established churches didn't necessarily do, right? And so you see that between Baptist and Methodist largely. So one of the big impacts of the Second Great Awakening, beyond kind of bringing people back to church and those kind of things, was that it was really the first time you saw huge social reform efforts by the church in the U.S. So you started to see abolition movements, abolition of slavery. You started to see all these kind of movements that were born out of this revival, trying to call culture and society back to the ways of God, to ways that were acceptable to Him, if you will. So, and as we just talked about, really the emergence of new denominations there, Methodism, the Baptists, all of those kind of grew within the 1800s as well. Yes, sir. I mean, Harvard was formed in early 1600s, somewhere in there, right? Which would have been a seminary originally, Yale as well. So separate from that, it would have mostly been post-Civil War, right? You saw a lot of them in the early 1900s. Once you kind of had the progressive movement, like Union Seminary in New York, Gordon Conwell, some of those are late 1800s, early 1900s. So I would say most of that was probably between let's say right at the time of Civil War, 1860, up to about 1920. It's when most of your independent seminaries, and that would have been largely when you had kind of that resurgence of when people started to see the university seminaries as kind of too liberal, right? They had made liberal movements. Then you started seeing other seminaries born, right, that were more specific, not liberal arts colleges, but they were specific seminaries again. So, the other thing you see largely in the 1800s is the beginning of missionary movements, right? So both in the U.S. and globally. So you get a lot of movements at this point from Protestants especially, going to reservations for indigenous populations. So you had missionaries not only within our own kind of borders, but you saw the beginning of missionaries going overseas, right? You get people like Charles Taylor, others who in the late 1800s are famous for kind of moving to those places, sensing this idea of going back and trying to bring the gospel to the world. A couple of key figures in the 1800s. Charles Finney. Anybody ever heard of Finney? So what we know as the church service was largely developed by Finney. Finney was really the first guy to do like altar calls. He brought in music, like more. So maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Most of the hymns that we love came from pub songs. They were bar songs. They took the music from bar songs and they rewrote the words largely. Right? Why? Because people already knew the bar songs, right? And so it was just a way of like connecting all of that. So Christianity taking stuff from culture and appropriating it for themselves is not new. Like that's happened for a long time. But your favorite hymn was probably sung in a pub with different words long before it was ever sung in the church, right? And so Finney was the first to kind of bring a lot of that into that. He had something they called the anxious bench. So when he would do his tent revivals, he would have like these benches that were set up for people who were not believers. And he would try to get people to help to like sit them in those. And then he would largely preach at them. And they call them the anxious bench, right? That he was trying to make them anxious, right? Trying to help them understand the problem of not being a follower of Jesus, the anxiousness that they should feel and those kind of things. Finney was really the first to kind of hone in on a couple of things. Really this like very American sense of individual choice, individual existence as a believer, right? That we kind of stand on our own. Like Finney was very much like in that place, not that it's wrong, just that it was a very unique kind of thing. People had never really heard that before. That Christianity was much more communal before that. And he certainly was one who really pushed for the idea of Christianity bringing moral reform on culture. That Christianity should impact the culture in a way that redeemed it or that brought some redemption towards it, some goodness towards it. Finney would go in on lunch breaks at these big factories, like textile factories in New York and Boston, and he would preach to people on their lunch hours. And people would not come back to work. Right? They would have these emotional religious experiences and they would like just be so overcome they couldn't come back to work. So there are literally places where they ran Finney out of town. Because it was kind of like Paul, right, when the silversmiths ran him out of town. Like Finney had a bit of that about him. Where they're like, hey, listen, my man, you're affecting business now. Like, please go somewhere else. And so Finney is known for kind of developing what we would consider American evangelicalism at some level. Right? What we know as church services, what we think of as an American church culture, largely Finney is a huge foundation in that. Somebody else that was really kind of, certainly has had a lasting impact. I don't know that we would consider him Christian in this way, but somebody in the 1820s, Joseph Smith. Like Mormonism emerges in the 1820s. That's really when he has his experiences and begins to talk about that. And you think about how that has impacted American society. And not only American society, but global society even, right? And the fact that that's only about 200 years old, right? It's a really relatively new faith system, right? I'm trying not to use the word cult. But that's 1820s, about the same time that Finney is having this impact. Joseph Smith kind of latches onto this rising religious nature in America. And he says, well, I've got one too. Right? And mine came straight from an angel. Right? And so this whole great awakening, the Second Great Awakening revival, it works itself out in various different ways, right? So you have a Finney, you also have a Joseph Smith. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In Florida as well. Like Florida, they were there in the early 1500s, I think, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. You had native peoples who were coming to the Catholic faith in Florida. It may be in the 1400s, right? I'd have to look at that a little bit. And so it's interesting. You have much more developed kind of Catholic systems in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, the West Coast than you do in the South, right? The South really had very little Catholic influence after the early 1500s. It kind of got wiped out largely, right? When the English captured it from the Spanish. But you see that not only in the church systems, but even in university systems, school systems. You have very developed Catholic education systems, Catholic health systems in the West, the Midwest, in ways that you don't necessarily in the Southwest or in the South especially, right? And that just speaks to where they were during those times, right? That largely those 13 colonies were pretty much, like you said, East Coast, right? They didn't really move beyond the Mississippi River until, 1820s, 1830s? They really started moving that way. And so predominantly, you have a much heavier Protestant influence in the South, a lot of even the East Coast beyond that, outside of your metropolitan areas, right? Boston, very Catholic, but again, that was not this early. A lot of that was 1800s, early 1800s, when you had the Irish coming in heavily, right? Same thing in New York, right? So the Catholic influence there is a little bit later. It's much older in the West and in the Midwest, I would say, at that scale anyway. So, and that worked its way out. I mean, especially in Florida, I know just because I'm from there, I guess, but the oldest established continuous settlement in the U.S. is in St. Augustine, Florida. It's the longest continuous established settlement in the U.S., right? Older than Jamestown, older than Plymouth, older than all that, right? But at the time, who was it settled by? The Spanish. And at one point, it was in French hands, and it was in English hands, and then it was in Confederate hands, and then it was in U.S. hands, right? So it's interesting. You go to a small city like St. Augustine, you see all of it, right? You've got every kind of church you can imagine in that little city, right? And they're all old, right? You got a Lutheran church that's 300 or 200 years old. You got a Spanish mission that's been there since the 1500s, right? And so it's interesting when we think about the development of religion, we do largely think about the colonies and moving from there, but there's a much older history than that in what we know as the U.S. now, right? And like you said, largely on the West Coast, Southwest, as the Spanish moved up, and in Florida and places like that. So, and the discovery of most of those areas was financed by who? Spain, which was who? Catholics. They were Catholic nations, right? And so they were exploring for a couple of different reasons, right? To spread their faith, but also to do what? Get gold, right? And so that has a long history across a lot of parts of what we know as the U.S. right today. So certainly those were there before even the colonies were operating in that. All right, so let's move on to the 1900s, and really the fundamental kind of dynamic during this period is what we would call kind of this wrestling match between fundamentalism and modernism. So If you think about the 20th century, what happened in the early 20th century that really marked not only the religious landscape, but pretty much the landscape of the West entirely? America, England, France, Belgium, all the Western European nations. What happened early in the 1900s that was like a formative shaping mechanism for all of them? World War I. Right? You think for 400, 500 years before that, you'd had these succeeding religious wars across Europe, right? In England, across Europe between France and others, right? You've had all of these wars. And then you get into the early 1900s, right? And you've got these competing empires and royal houses that are at odds with one another. World War I is largely started by what we would say it was started by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, but that was just the kind of the culmination of a lot of things, right? And so you move from what has been a very religiously oriented continent to something entirely different, right? That the hopefulness of religion was largely done away with during World War I in Europe. That at the end of World War I, largely people in Europe, and we didn't get it as much because we were a very late entrant to that, even though we lost quite a few soldiers. It wasn't nearly what France lost or what England lost, Germany lost during that period. And so out of World War I, you largely have a Western world that is now disillusioned with religion. Because they look at what happened in World War I and they say, how could God let, was it 11 or 12 million people who died in World War I? Somewhere in there? How could God let that happen? And you've also got the kind of the culmination of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age, right? You've got all of this like new scientific information and discovery that's happening, and people are starting to say, yeah, those are great stories, but we know better now, right? We can explain this scientifically. And so you get kind of this really, this at odds kind of feeling between religion and kind of scientific naturalism, right? This idea that we can explain things. We don't have to lean on these old stories about God and all of those things anymore. So you think about in that 100 years, from 1900 to 2000, let's say, Europe goes from a very Christian place to a place where almost nobody attends church. And they're very skeptical of it in 100 years. You go from 50 to 60% attendance to 6 in 100 years. That this whole thing like goes downhill quickly during the 1900s especially, right? A lot of it affected, especially in Western Europe, by World War I and what they saw come out of that, right? The disillusionment of this whole thing. So that the early 20th century saw this fierce debate between fundamentalists who kind of emphasized strict adherence to traditional beliefs in biblical literalism and modernists who kind of sought to reconcile faith with modern scientific understanding. So if you think of things in the U.S. that happened during this, something like the Scopes trial, 1925, right? What were they arguing in the Scopes trial? Anybody know? Evolution in the schools, right? Are we going to teach this? Is evolution, is this something that we want to like move forward with as a viable truth about the way that humans developed, right? And so it's a fundamental kind of turning point for us as a nation because we have a high court basically taking this into consideration, considering the reality of religion as something that we should be instructing people with, right? And so I want you to think about the formative nature of that. That up until this time, people have really kind of just, whether you went to church every week or not, you kind of believed at some level this is the way things are. And we start to see this huge turn in the early 1900s where people start going, yeah, but is that really the way it is? Right? Because we have telescopes and we can see things. We can get down to the atomic level over the next 30 or 40 years and all of these kind of things. Does all of this really work together? Right? So you get this clash between the two. So that's a big one, this battle between fundamentalism and kind of modernism or progressivism. The other big movement that we would see in the early 1900s and throughout is really the social gospel movement, right? That the gospel is meant to be a social lifter, right? That it's meant to take care of the oppressed, those who are hurting, all of these kind of things. There's a huge kind of movement in that in the early 1900s. We see it in things like the temperance movement, right? No alcohol, right? The Prohibition Act, right? Largely driven by women who were tired of their husbands stumbling home. And they were influenced by the church, and they said, hey, listen, we can rally and we can make this happen. And they did. Right? Ladies, don't get any ideas. Didn't work then, it won't work this time. Right? But there was this belief that when you rally all of this together, we can make real social change. Right? We saw that in the movement to abolish slavery, right? Both in the England and the U.S., it was largely driven by people of faith. Now, the interesting thing is, who were they arguing against? Other people of faith, right? Largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. is, anybody know? By number. The largest Protestant denomination in the United States. Southern Baptist. Why does the Southern Baptist Convention exist? They split with the American Baptist over slavery. The Southern Baptist said, no, we think it's fine to own slaves. You guys aren't going to tell us. We'll just start our own. And they weren't the only ones on that side. There were a lot of Christians who used the Bible to defend slavery. And on the other side, you had other Christians going, no, what are you talking about? Does that sound familiar at all? That just because we're Christian doesn't mean we agree on the way this thing plays out, especially in a cultural context, right? That there's always been kind of cooperation, but also conflict within the church in America, right? That's not a new thing. It's been there for a long time. So you see kind of this battle between fundamentalism, modernism, and then you see also the emergence of the social gospel movement. So 1900s, a couple of people that are key figures there. You really have the rise post-World War II, of what we would consider the modern evangelist. People holding massive rallies, right? And so when you think of those, who do you think of? Billy Graham. So Billy Graham is kind of the renowned, there are a lot of them, but he's the one that really kind of earned, and rightly so, I think, a lot of public trust and things like that, and became very involved in the political strata in D.C., right? Became very close friends with somebody you may know, Mr. Richard Nixon. Was his spiritual advisor, right? And so one of the other things we see in the 1900s, and again, this is not new, we saw it in the colonies. It just rears its head in different ways. Again, kind of this mingling of government and spirituality, right? And at some level, they are always going to have to figure out how to exist together. And that's the question we have to constantly ask, is how do we make these exist together in a way that honors God, right? So you have Billy Graham on one side. You have a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch, who is really a theologian who kind of is credited with starting what we would consider the social gospel movement in the U.S. And he really argued that Christianity must, if it's true Christianity, it has to address social injustices and work towards the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. That it has to go beyond the building. It has to impact the injustices that we see in our society, right? One of his writings is called A Theology for the Social Gospel, and it really kind of became foundational for what we would consider progressive Christian thought, right? Another way to say that, if you're a common parlance, would be woke, right? If you work in those terms, some people would call him woke. But a lot of what he has to say is also really critical for us to understand. That religion can't just benefit me. Christianity just can't benefit me. it has to go beyond me at some level if it's real in my heart, my life, right? And so you see kind of that development and that growth as well. Any questions about the 1900s? It's the first one any of us were alive in, so you may know more about that one. I don't know. Any thoughts? Nothing? What else did you see about churches that changed in the 1900s? More mid-century, post-World War II. There are no wrong answers. If you noticed it, you noticed it. Okay. Sociologists would say that one thing that happened in the mid-1900s, like the 50s and the 60s especially, was that we went from a culture that valued external authority to a culture that really valued internal authority. So what they mean by that, when sociologists talk about those ideas, we used to have these external authorities that everybody kind of acceded to. Education systems, government, the church. Somewhere post-World War II, we turned to internal authorities. What does that mean? I'm my authority. Nobody tells me what to do. I call it the Cartman move. You probably don't know what that means. But I do what I want. Nobody tells me what to do. Right? That's not just something we're theorizing. Sociologists you can trace that. Then we lost respect for these external things. We said, nobody's going to tell me what to do. I don't have to respect that. And all we really started to respect was how I feel, my perception. And so that has affected not just church, but everything, right? And I think it's a pretty accurate representation of development in our culture. That we used to respect things beyond ourselves. Now we just respect how I feel about things. That's not a positive move, right? And so that's affected churches in a lot of ways as well. All right, anybody else? Steve?
Are you saying that change to look internal resulted from World War I and World War II?
No, I think I would say it kind of began in the mid-boomers.
Where did the distrust come from?
I think a lot of it came, so I think you see a lot of it during the World War, like Vietnam period, Korean War, a real distrust for the government, rightly so at some level, right? That they weren't telling whole stories. And I think a lot of it was also parenting. Like I think a lot of parents started to really make children the central focus of the family. That everything was about the child. And so if a child is raised thinking that everything's about them, guess what they believe about life? Everything's about me. Right? So parents who had a little bit of distrust passed that down to their children. It became a larger distrust. Not just of one institution, but in institutions in general. Right? If you think about some of the movements of the 60s, right? The whole rebel, like bikers, right? Like hippies, right? All of that was about distrust of big external things. Right? And people started saying things, well, like, just follow your heart, man. When the Bible says the heart is deceptive above all things. Well, just do what you feel. Well, sometimes your feelings lie. Right? And so, really, I think it's mainly during the 60s, right? Like 60s and 70s, the Vietnam period, I think, really solidified a lot of that. Was people just started distrusting these outside institutions. And I think there are legitimate reasons for that. Right? I don't think people were just looking to do it. I think people started looking and going, hey, you're lying to us about a lot of stuff. So I'm not sure that I want to trust you anymore. The problem is we turned our trust to somebody who's just as deceptive. Me. Like I'm just as deceptive to me as to the government could ever be. Right? But we put our trust in ourselves because we never really like to admit that we lie to ourselves. We rationalized our way out of that, or at least I do. So, Dwayne, I'm sorry. Say it again.
specifically in the war, where they try to control the narrative quite a bit there.
Well, yeah, I think, yeah, there's some great discussion around that, right? Like, I think you go back to like World War II, certainly World War One, there's even more of it, but the way that like the government controlled narratives, right? They censored a whole lot of stuff, and I understand why they did some of it, right? Like, and then you get to Vietnam, and I was not alive during Vietnam. I was born right after it. But all of a sudden, you had like embedded cameramen, and they're sending back videos of dudes dying in rice paddies, and you're like, well, no, that's not what you told us war was. And then you get to Iraq, and like, you can watch it on YouTube or live, right? And even more and more, you realize, man, all this time, they've not been telling us the truth, right? And that's not just an American government issue, that's just a government issue, right? Our government's complicit in the ways all governments probably are. So I think along the way, you started with this kind of group of people who mistrusted the government for legitimate reasons, and over time, and again, it's not just the government that we figured out was lying to us at times. The church has done the same. When we find out that the Catholic Church was moving abusers around for years, protecting them. And that's not just a Catholic thing. The Southern Baptists did the same thing. Pentecostals have done it. All churches have done it. And so I think for us, we look at it and we go, why should I trust anybody? All of these structures and organizations have just lied, right? And again, I think we're much more like gracious with ourselves on that stuff than we are other things. And so I think a lot of it's just an accumulation over time of they've just not told us the truth on a lot of stuff. And even when the truth came out, a lot of times they didn't go back and apologize. It was never made right for a lot of people, right? Victims were attacked. They were told you're lying. They were told why? To protect power and to protect people in power. And I think the last 30 or 40, 50 years have just borne that out time and time again. I mean, think about the only times you really hear about the American church now. It's because a pastor slept with some lady or whatever, right? Like abusing a kid. Like we don't ever hear good things. So part of it is media narrative, right? They're not ever talking about the good stuff that the church has done for a long time and continues to do. But again, at the end of the day, it's public perception. That drives a lot of things. And so I think the church was caught up in other institutions, and that the real move away was from trust of institution. And the church just happened to be one of those. And we've not done a good job of separating ourselves from the others, right? That they think we're just a monolith like the government and all of that. I don't think that's a true story, but I think it's the way most people see it. So, anything else in the mid-50s, early 60s, 70s that changed greatly in the American church? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. From what I hear, they were great. Everybody I talked to about them was like, they were wonderful. I think they were the golden age of America, honestly.
I was born before Pearl Harbor. My mother never worked outside the house
Absolutely.
at all. I came home from school, she was there every day,
Yep.
all the way through World War I.
Yeah.
World War II, not that.
Yeah.
But anyway.
They're both world wars.
Anyway, but all the ladies who had to go to work because the men were all gone to war,
Mm-hmm.
they left the kitchens and the bathrooms and the bedrooms and the laundry, and they went to work,
And a lot of them decided they didn't want to go back.
that's it. And we lost our mothers who have one of the greatest influences on their children's moral development.
And I think that's a great point, Charlotte. I think you did have this kind of movement in the 50s and 60s where a lot of women went to work. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I don't know. But I think, Absolutely it is necessary, especially now for a lot of people. It's absolutely necessary. Or at least it's very hard to imagine it not being necessary. Let me say it that way. But I think what happened as a result of that is a lot of kids were born and raised by people who were not their parents. And I'm not talking about grandparents. I'm talking about institutions, schools, all those things became more formative. They also saw more about them that was wrong, that had always been there at some level. But because they were there more than they had ever been, they become more apparent. It's like the longer you spend time with somebody, you start noticing foibles about them that if you just see them every once in a while, you didn't see. I think the increased exposure to them actually led to distrust of them at some level, right? And so I think that change in the family has been a huge one for us as a culture, that we really don't raise our kids anymore. And I'm saying as someone that's been true of me, right? Somebody was asking me the other day, like, if you could do anything differently about with your kids, what would you do? And I said, I would not buy them a cell phone until they were in college. I would refuse to give them one.
TV, not good either.
I wouldn't let them watch that all the time either, right? I don't even know if they know how to watch TV anymore, right? Like it's all streaming platforms now, right? So I think there are the 19th century had a lot of huge changes that I don't think we fully pay attention to. Right, the one that I was kind of alluding to that I think really is a huge difference that really happened in the 70s, 80s, and then huge in the 90s was the growth of the megachurch. These massive churches. So it's interesting, in the last 30 years, you could get larger and larger churches, but the U.S. becomes less and less Christian. Consistently. The biggest churches get bigger, but we become less Christian. Why would that be? So what led to the rise of megachurches? Anybody have any ideas? I'm just going to give you an opinion. I don't know that it's right, but I think it seems pretty close. What do you think? Why did megachurches come to exist? Because before that, how did people go to church? You went in your community, right? It was in your neighborhood. You knew everybody. You guys went to the same schools. You went to the same hairdresser. You went to, the guys drank at the same bar after work. And everybody on Sunday went to this church. In fact, they called them often the community church, right? And so that was the way church had been done forever. Even in the Catholic system, it's built on a parish model. Right? So you go to the parish that's closest to you. Think about how the Mormons do their wards. You go to the ward closest to you. Jehovah's Witnesses do the same thing. They still do that. Right? We're a very interesting phenomenon in the evangelical Christian church. We're one of the few that doesn't do that. So, how did the megachurch start? Why did it start? Okay, growth of cities, but most of them aren't in city centers. Okay. Okay. Cars. Mobility. Here's what I think. You don't have to agree with me. I think it was largely about mobility. People for the first time had options. And we are a society rooted in consumerism. What do you want? Like Burger King gets this, right? Have it your way. So what do we start doing to people at churches? What is it that you want? What do you feel like you need? Let's build our church around what the people tell us they need. So it's not Christianity, it's consumerism. I'm not saying it's not Christian. I'm just saying it's largely not driven by that. It's driven by what do I want?
I think comparison makes its way in there
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we're Americans. We like the newest and the best, right? Like my son's been asking me all week for an iPhone 16. I'm like, why do you need it? Because I do. I'm like, that's exactly the reason you don't need it, right? Why? Why do we need new things? Why do we need bigger, better things? I think it goes back to what we talked a little bit about in teaching this morning. We have a real contentment problem.
Jason, it sounds like how Rick Warren started his church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Asking people in the neighborhood, why don't we go to church?
absolutely.
And he responded to that.
Absolutely. And I think Warren was well intended. I think he was trying to reach people far from God. What we found in most megachurches, the studies will tell you this, that very few people come to faith in them. Or in small churches anymore. It's not just big, I'm not saying big churches are bad. That's not my point at all. My point is they're a particularly American phenomenon. And why is that? What was wrong with neighborhood churches where you knew everybody and that you guys lived in the same space and the same thing? What was the problem with that? That might be true. Yeah. Familiarity breeds, like whatever that saying is, right? Like contempt. Familiarity breeds contempt. Yeah.
There's an entertainment value in megachurches.
Yeah.
They draw good talent.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And anonymity.
Yeah, people do like that.
Load in and out.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Well, they can't, right? Like it's kind of a base denominator existence. Like least common denominator, right? Like that's kind of it for it, right? It has to be at that level. And please hear me, this is not a critique of megachurches for me. It's just an interesting idea to me that we don't really see these happen anywhere else in the world. Unless they were influenced by Americans. You see them in Australia, but they largely came from the US with that. You see them in Western Europe, but largely those are church plants from American organizations, right? So it's a particularly American way of doing church, right? Not good or bad. Nothing wrong with it at some level, right? But it is interesting to me to think about the period of the rise of those types of churches has actually been it corresponds to one of the most rapid decreases of church attendance in the U.S. in U.S. history. So how do those coexist?
Well, a question. I grew up in Southern California
Sure.
in the 70s, and so I was surrounded by the Jesus People movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some megachurches respond out of that movement.
Sure.
Was that just a blip on the West Coast, or did that have larger...
So I don't think the Jesus People was a huge movement like beyond the West Coast too much. I'm sure it influenced people that went and started churches in other places. I think really a couple of things about the rise of megachurches, right? I think a lot of it's mobility and like choice issue. Like I think it's really driven by that, right? The other side of it was really this idea you saw kind of in the 80s. You really saw what we would consider non-denominational churches start. Those didn't really exist much before the 80s. Everything was pretty denominational. Now you had some small off-splinters out in the country that some dudes like, hey, I just want to start a church. But you didn't see them in urban centers very often or in suburbs, right? I think that's another side of this is the suburb idea. Like I think you see really kind of some correspondence to the suburbs and the rise of big churches, right? And so there's a lot there. But I think non-denominationalism, most large churches are non-denominational. There aren't a lot of huge denominational churches, right? There are some exceptions, especially in the Southern Baptist side. You get a lot of those, or quite a few of those. But a lot of them are predominantly non-denominational. So they exist to themselves, right? Like no oversight, which creates a fast growth, but it also lends itself to a really fast problem, right? And back to what was mentioned earlier, I think part of it was, like Jim, I think you mentioned entertainment, and somebody also mentioned cult of personality. I think you bring those two together, you get a perfect American idea. Charismatic leader, really good music, now we can go. You know what I mean? Like now we're ready. And so it's an interesting phenomenon the last little while. I think the other thing that we're starting to see is obviously in the 2000s, we'll kind of close with this. A couple of things that you're really seeing in the 2000s. Again, that continued growth of non-denominational churches, that's not going away, it's just increasing. And because of that, it's led to a lot of diversity on almost every level, styles of service, styles of liturgy, music, all of those things, styles of communication, look of church, all of those have grown in terms of diversity just because there's really not any overarching organizations telling everybody how it has to be done necessarily, right? There's nobody dictating that for most of the, most newer churches especially. The other side of it in the U.S. is that you've really continued to see a growth in kind of diversity and globalization, right? So largely what we've talked about tonight is kind of the white Protestant church, right? We didn't talk a lot about post-Civil War, the rise of the black church, right? And things like the AME, so the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Kojic, Church of God in Christ, all these large African American denominations that really have started post-Civil War and have continued to grow and prosper in many ways, right? So a lot of those as well. The last 40 to 50 years with all of the immigration that we've seen from around the world. So you've seen significant growth among Latino populations, the Latino churches, Asian churches, right? In fact, if you go over to the library right by Sparks High, that used to be a synagogue across from there? Was it a Baptist church that is now a Buddhist center? Right? It's funny because there's still a menorah on the front of it, I think. Right? But it's Buddhist, which always makes me laugh when I drive by it every day. I'm like, oh, that's funny. All right. So for some reason, it's always funny every time I see it. It's just interesting to me. Right? So you see like this growth in not only different ethnicities within Christianity and different flavors of that, but you also see increasing growth of other faiths in ways that we've never seen before, right? Buddhism, Islam, obviously, growing tremendously in certain areas and all over the country at some level. And so not only is the church much more diverse, but our religious landscape is becoming more and more diverse. And the question really for us is, what do we do in that? Right, so do we revert back to the early colonists who are trying to control it and say, listen, we're trying to build a Christian city on a hill here. You boys are going to have to get in line, you're going to have to go somewhere else. Or do we kind of take more of that Rhode Island approach that we talked about? Hey, yeah, we want to follow Jesus. That's what we're going to do. We also want to welcome people and see if it may be our life a better way of evangelizing, a better way of calling people to God than telling them they have to follow him. That's never really worked. And so, is pluralism a good idea? Is it something that Christians can live in and exist in a way that glorifies God? That's a real question that a lot of people I think are asking right now. Is pluralism an evil? Or has it been something that the U.S. was always about? Welcoming people, allowing them to follow their life, their faith, maybe not agreeing with it, but creating space for people, right? And that's a question that we're all wrestling with, right? And nobody seems to have a whole lot of answers. I don't have any answers. I don't know if you do. Our politicians certainly don't seem to have any. So what does it look like for us to follow Jesus in this moment? Learning the lessons of our ancestors and our forefathers and the people that we talked about tonight. What should be the place of the church in the culture that we find ourselves in? What should our voice be? And how do we glorify God and show his goodness in an increasingly complex culture, right? And it's not going to go back to the way that it was, right? Sometimes when you open the barn door, the horse is out, right? So rather than trying to get back to something, how do we work at making where we are something that glorifies God and that builds goodwill with our neighbors, right? Which I think is what Acts talks about, building goodwill with our neighbors as followers of Jesus, right? Those are the lessons that I think our forefathers are teaching us if we listen. If it was a failure in the 1600s, it's probably not going to work tremendously well in the 2020s. Human nature hasn't really changed very much, right? So for me, I think it's very important that we understand where we came from, the challenges that has brought to us, that have shaped us, and it should be at some level a guiding light to lead us forward, to know not necessarily what we have to do or what we should do, but maybe to give some insight at least into the things that maybe we shouldn't do. So, what are your thoughts? Having heard all of this, talked about this, and this is just scratching the surface, I get it. There's not a whole lot of this that we can fully cover in an hour plus, hour and a half right now. But looking and thinking about this today, what is the place of the church in a modern America? What is our role in a modern America? Any thoughts? Okay. How do we do that? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anybody else? My uncle sold that stuff. I didn't like to visit my uncle because he tried to put me and my brother to work boxing stuff up, and then he didn't pay us. So me and Amway have a bad association. I still don't know what they sold. I just know it came in boxes. I think they sold basically everything, right? Like deodorant, cleaners. Oh yeah, great. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anybody else? What's our place? Well, absolutely. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yep. Yeah, I think the factors are not necessarily the same, but I think the decline is similar, right? Which is why I broached the subject a little bit tonight of the idea of the growth of like big churches. I think you have to examine why churches are getting bigger and less Christians are the result. If those are successes, why are we losing people overall? Is it because they're doing great and all the other churches are doing awful? That could be, maybe. Or have we misdefined what success is for churches? Like I was thinking about this. Ryan Ashley's dad, Dean, if you've ever met Dean, Dean pastored a little church, Church of God over on Richards Way for 40-something years, I think. He just retired last Sunday. So when he retired, they had like 8 people left in the church. He started with more than that. Success or failure? So those 8 people on his last day told him how pivotal he had been in their faith journey. They had stayed in the faith and stayed in that place because of the way he impacted them, and the way he loved them. I think the vast majority of, especially Christian pastors, Christian leaders, would tell you that he was a failure. Because again, we're consumers. We're marked by growth means health. No, right? Look at our health problems as a culture. Bigger doesn't always mean better. So maybe in the midst of, even back to Warren just a little bit, right? And I appreciate what Rick Warren has done. But the 80s and 90s were defined by what we call a church growth model. That getting bigger churches meant you were impacting the culture and the kingdom for good. I'm not sure that was always true. I think a lot of it was driven by big egos. And we took business principles and we brought them into the church and we said, well, if we just market it the right way and if we just have the right presentation, then people will come to Jesus. Almost like Jesus wasn't enough on his own.
Will people come to your church? Will they come to Jesus? That's a different question.
Those are two different things. And I don't think we've always treated them that way. You know what I mean?
Right. I think we've learned.
Yeah, yeah.
And were they motivated by how much money they were going to get by the extra people?
Sure. Yeah. I think back to the question we asked earlier when we were talking about the awakenings. Where are we at? Are we the middle of the decline? Are we close to the upswing? I think it depends on what we do.
So what would you say, how do we grow wide and deep at the same time?
I think it's hard and it takes time. I think one of the challenges is like in the church growth mindset, right? It was always like, how do we grow quickly? But I grew up on a tree farm. Trees don't grow quickly. Trees take time. Crops are always like that. They take time and they take constant attention and they take all kinds of input that you have to give them. And I think we talked about the challenges of like the community church, the neighborhood church. I think one of the beauties of it was that people were there for a long time. And they had to learn to live with each other, good and bad. When we have created a system where as soon as you don't like something, you can go move and leave people behind and do something else, that's not a healthy system. You would never do that to your family. You would never have an argument with your kid and be like, all right, you're gone. We got 3 more. I saw some other kids down the road. I'll pick them up on the way. You know what I mean? Like, we do things in church that we wouldn't do in any other relationship. And so I think, how do you grow relationships with your kids? How do you grow deep and wide kids? How do you grow deep and wide marriages? It takes time. And it's challenging. And it's messy. But the alternative is having a reality show version of those relationships. That it looks good until you look behind the camera. And you look behind the scenes, and it was never real. And back to what we were talking about earlier, Steve, with the disillusionment, I think what happened is that the camera got pulled back on a lot of institutions. People saw what it really was. And they said, I don't want that. So I'm a big believer, to answer your question, Sarah, I'm a big believer that the way the church grows is one person to one person. And that everybody rallying behind the mission of displaying God's goodness everywhere that we go. That fully intentionalizing every area of my life to point people towards the goodness of God. That is the church's job, but guess what the church is? What big churches did forever is they told people, you don't have to do it, we'll do it. We pay people to do it. And when we pay people to do it, guess who does it? Mostly it's the people we pay to do it. And so I'm a big believer in what Martin Luther, the Reformation, what was Martin Luther's big driving statement? His driving idea. The priesthood of all believers. That when Luther looked at the Catholic Church, what he saw was that the average person who sat in a mass once a week really had no interaction and involvement with God whatsoever. That it was just done by the paid clergy. And they had monopolized all the power, and they said they were the only ones who could do it. And what did Luther say, basically? No, you can do it. I think the way forward is to call people back to the real things. That doesn't sell very well sometimes. It's easier to sell the nice, shiny, new. But I don't know about you, but I've found that a lot of the stuff that is being built now doesn't last in the same way that things that were built 70 or 80 years ago were built. Because they know all people really care about now is how does it look when you buy it? Does it serve me well just for this time? Won't need it forever. But I've got some things that were my grandpa's that were built in the teens and 20s. Those things are just built differently, man. They're more meaningful to me. Not just because of him, but because of the quality and the way they were built. So I think, for me, I think we could be in the mid, I think we could be on the upswing. But the upswing looks like us, or it looks like me. I won't even make this the claim for anybody else, just me. It requires of me stepping outside of comfortable faith and moving into a place where I really care about other people. Not just those around me. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and they were talking about the importance of family. And that's a huge thing. We all understand that, the importance of our families. And as part of the conversation, we were talking about just how much time it takes with families, right? Your kids are growing up. You've got all these things that you're trying to figure out, how do you spend time everywhere? And I'm not someone who pretends I always did it well. And he started asking, well, why do you spend time here, and why are you doing that? Sometimes I didn't have great answers for him, honestly. But one of the things we were talking about was how much time it takes for me to do what I do at Sparks High. And to be honest with you, there have been times where I've missed my son's game to be at one of those games. I made a choice to do that at times, right? Looking back, would I do it again? I don't know, maybe. And he said, well, why would you do that? And I said, well, for me, if I only take care of my family, what happens to all those who don't have families? Do I just write them off? Are they just out of luck? And I think if we're not careful, we get into this space where we just make our Christian lives really, really small. And that maybe that's not the place forward for us. Or at least for me, it's not. Because I can name 32 names right now that don't have any of that. And I'm not willing to resign them to the fact that they just don't get it. But that's me. A lot of people don't see it that way, and I understand that too. I get it. So, I don't think that's a good answer to your question, but. Anybody else?
I asked Dean if he had a chance to kind of take in his retirement
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned, I think, Jetta, maybe you mentioned this. One of the challenges of being in a larger church is that people can be anonymous. I'm kind of a huge believer we shouldn't allow people to be anonymous. We should work really hard to make sure that doesn't happen. I know some people will just make it happen because that's kind of the way they think they want their life to go. But not a huge believer in systems that allow for that broadly, for people to just be anonymous. It's interesting, I was reading an article last week that we are at the highest rates of combined suicidality and feelings of loneliness and depression in the history of the United States right now. You take all of those into consideration, we are the most disconnected we've ever been as a country in terms of people feeling connected to other people at any level. I think that's the way forward for the church. That what is it that people actually need, not what they want, right? Because we all have a sense of what we want, and we're not always right about that. But what is it that God designed us for that people are looking for? And I think it's connection with each other. That is the predominant challenge of our society, is that people are disconnected. So what should we do? Everything we can to connect people at a level beyond superficial. So I think that's one thing that old neighborhood churches did pretty well. Wasn't always pleasurable. Sometimes you had to deal with idiots. Sometimes you were the idiot that other people had to deal with. But I think that is something we should learn from them. That there's something valuable about spending a lot of time and long time together, right? That there's a connecting factor that you can't make up without time spent. And I think that's a huge thing. So, anybody else before we get out of here? Jim?
If you could project yourself forward and look back on the next move that maybe is starting on that switch, what would that look like?
I think one of the interesting dynamics that maybe I notice in the last 30 years of churches is that for a long time, and maybe it's because I grew up in a specific kind of church, but it seemed like when you came to faith, churches often pulled you out of your community and your connection and asked you to make new ones, right? And it was always this line about, well, if you hang out with sinners, that's too great for you. Well, that's interesting because Jesus did it all the time and he seemed okay. You know what I mean? And there's a level of maturity that's required for that. I get that. But I really think it's really about helping people understand living intentionally as Christians where they are, not asking them to come to new spaces necessarily, right? So I think about, the way that what they would call attractional models of church was how do we get them to the building? I think that was one of the worst things we ever did. I think it's about how do we get people to where they actually are? How do you become an influence for Jesus in your neighborhood? How do you become an influence for Jesus in your job? How do you become an influence for Jesus in the school that you're in? Right? How do you fully live as a Christian where you already are? Is a great question to me. And it's one of the ones we never really ask people very much. We just told people the more you came to the building, the more spiritual you were. And I think that was a bad messaging. Because I know a lot of people who spent a lot of time in church buildings and did not become more like Jesus. And I was one of them for a long time, right? That's just true. And so, I think there are a lot of interesting things and all of these things were well intended. Nobody thought these were going to be bad things. But you think about most churches you walk in now, most modern churches, what do they look like? They look like Starbucks. They look like anywhere else you go in. And why did we do that originally? Because we wanted people to feel comfortable. I actually think we should build buildings that when people walk in them, they make you feel like, oh, this is different. This is like a space where God may be present. Like, there's a difference in walking into a modern American church and walking into the cathedral at Gothenburg, right? There's a difference in that. And so I think we overthought so many things, and we try to approach it pragmatically like good business-minded Americans would. And when you build things like businesses, guess what you get? You get businesses. And so I think the big swing for the American church is away from entrepreneurial and business-minded back to places of real meaning and purpose and challenge even. That we're asking people to, do things beyond themselves, because that's the space that God shows up in. That's where he is. And so I think when we told people, just do the base minimum, just show up, what we got out of that was that. You know what I mean? And it was well intended. I understand why we did it. I get it. I was part of it. I just think we have to at some point admit that we did things wrong. That the results they were not what we thought they were going to be. And that we were very successful at doing it, but the success was not what we thought it was going to be. It was something different. And so I saw a statistic, in fact, I think I put it on Instagram. Thanks, Dwayne, for liking it. I appreciate it. 1 and 2. I get big likes. Yeah, absolutely. But it was showing like, so over the last 50 years, decade by decade, it was looking at people who identify as evangelical Christians and their church attendance. So, right now, less than 50% of people who identify as evangelical Christians show up to church once a month. 33% of them don't come more than twice a year. But they identify as Christian. Somewhere there's a disconnect. Where did they learn that? They learned it somewhere. I think we may have taught them. And so the unlearning is the hard part, right? The easiest people to talk to about Jesus are people who have no background with Jesus, because it's kind of like teaching, somebody a brand new skill. I always think in football, the easiest people to teach are the people who've never played football, because they don't have any bad habits, right? I think our big challenge the big opportunity and the big hope I have is that we have a huge percentage of our population who really have no interaction with Jesus whatsoever. So they're not automatically opposed to it. That's actually a huge opportunity and hope for me, is that we have these huge amounts of people who aren't opposed to Jesus at all. They just haven't had anybody talk to them about him yet. That's the way for the church forward, right? And to me, those are one-on-one conversations. Those are personal conversations. Those are not digital. It's face-to-face, right? Which is why it requires everybody to be a part of it, I think. Yep.
So I'm young, so I have my own experiences. I've grown up in
Are you?
church specifically.
Are you young?
Yeah, I am.
You're much younger than me. Much younger than me.
So I get the one-on-one. I believe in that.
Sure.
Moving forward, do you see a way for that and a Sunday
Yeah. I think Sunday always,
healthily, like together?
yeah, I don't think Sunday can be disconnected from it.
And
I-
so what is the benefit of
Yeah.
a Sunday gathering of all the people
Yeah.
together in your mind moving forward?
I think we talk about this on Sundays, or I try to at least, is this idea of Sunday, if we frame it as in what it is, rather than trying to pretend it's something it's not. Like it's actually critical. Because when we show up on Sunday, what are we doing? We're making a choice to come together with the corporate body and to worship in a way that we can't individually. Like that matters. It hugely matters. I think the challenge the last 30 or 40 years is we told people that was kind of all that really mattered. there are some things that a Sunday cannot accomplish in terms of spiritual development for people, right? And so I think the thing that we are trying to work on as a church, and we're always trying to figure this out, how do you connect Sunday to the rest of the things that we want people to engage in? And so that it's not separate, disconnected ideas. They're all the same thing, right? Because ultimately, Jesus says, go and make disciples. Not just believers, disciples. And I'm a huge believer, right, that in my role, I cannot be the sole discipler for most people in this congregation. That 30 minutes, let's be honest, 50 minutes on a Sunday, and I might be still lowballing sometimes, that I think it's interesting. I talk to people all the time, people of faith, and I'm asking them like, well, who really influences you? So many of them are people they've never met. So many are like preachers on YouTube or on TV, and they're like, oh, I'm being discipled. I'm like, no, you're not, man. No, you're not. Not in the way that's sustainable. You're not. And that conversation doesn't always go well. But there's a reason to me that Jesus tells those two to leave the nets. That it wasn't just enough for them to hear from him for 30 minutes in a synagogue or at a house once a week. They actually had to like walk with him. And so I think the two are working in the same direction, but they work different things. I worked in clinical health for a long time with people who were dealing with addiction. And so when you would bring someone in on the unit that I worked on, you would bring them in, and generally it was the 30-day stay. Detox for a week or two, depending on what they were in, and then you had kind of 2 more weeks where they stayed, and you're trying to like instill these new habits and all that stuff, get their meds balanced, all that stuff. So that 30 days is critical. But that 30 days will not keep anybody clean. So at the end of 30 days, what do we do with people? You refer them to an outpatient or an IOP, an intensive outpatient system, or to something like that, right? So which one got them clean? The 30 days or the IOP? Both. The 30 days were critical to get them to a point where they were ready to deal with a therapist on an IOP plan, right? I think Sunday is kind of like the 30 days to me. It's critical. It gets people in the door, right? It gives them a place to find some semblance of community, to know that they're not alone, all that stuff. But the heavy work is done not on Sundays. That's the IOP. And so I think we've tried to say to people, well, just give us 30 days. We'll change your life. And that's not true. And so I think for us, how do we merge the two? That's why we do this all the time with our groups. Why do we marry teaching with groups for those who are willing? So that it's all connected. So that we're all moving in the same direction. To me, that's the way forward. I don't want people in groups just to be in groups. To me, it has real intention. You know what I mean? And so I think that, for me at least, is a vision of the way forward. How do we marry Sunday with everything else in a way that they're not different things? They're all moving in the direction of creating disciples. So, well, some of your kids are running wild in the halls. And we've been here quite a while, and we've talked a lot about a lot more than American church history, which is a good thing, right? Because hopefully those are the lessons we're learning from it. But thank you guys for coming tonight. I'll pray. We'll get out of here. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Father, thank you for this night. Thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for all of those who have invested in ways in the past that have made it possible for us to be people of faith. That none of us came to this on our own, that you used people to draw us to yourself largely. And so thank you for those people. And Father, as we thank you for those people, we also want to be those people. That in the same way that people have been formative in our faith journey, we want to be formative in others' journey. And so we want to do that in a way that glorifies you and that respects and honors other people. And so, God, we need wisdom on that. How do we do that? How do we do it in a way that is not just active, but in a way that is honoring? And so, Father, we know that you are the only one who can help us and lead us in those things. So we look to you. Make our hearts attentive to your voice and your leading.